If you're working in India, there's a single piece of legislation that has a huge impact on your life, your paycheck. In this explainer, we're going to break down the Code on Wages 2019. Think of it as the modern rule book for what you earn, when you get paid, and a whole lot more. So to really get why this code is such a big deal, you got to look at what came before it. The old system was, well, let's just say it was complicated. You had 4 different major laws floating around: the Payment of Wages Act, the Minimum Wages Act, the Payment of Bonus Act, and the Equal Remuneration Act. Each one had its own set of rules and its own definitions. So you can imagine, right? For both employers and employees, trying to keep all of that straight was just a massive headache. Which law applied to you? What were the exact rules? It just created a ton of confusion. And that's where 2019 comes in. Parliament basically took a look at this mess and decided to take a huge step toward making things simpler. It got rid of those 4 old laws and merged all their key ideas into one big piece of legislation, the Code on Wages. The goal was pretty clear: create one streamlined system for everybody. So here's our game plan. We're going to tackle 5 key parts of this code. We'll start with what the law actually considers your paycheck. Then we'll get into the minimum wage safety net, the rules on when and how you get paid, the deal with your annual bonus. And finally, we'll talk about why this code is so important. All right, let's start at square one. Before we can even talk about minimum wage or bonuses, we have to answer a really basic question. What does the law actually count as wages? Because it's probably not what you think. The code gives us this core definition, right? It says wages are basically all the payments you get in money for the work you do. And this is a big but, the real story is in the details of what's included and, more importantly, what's left out. And this is where it gets really interesting. For legal calculations, your wages are specifically made up of your basic pay, your dearness allowance, and your retaining allowance. Now, look at what's excluded: your bonus, your HRA, overtime, all that stuff. And this is so important because that specific definition of wages is what's used to calculate things like minimum pay and your bonus, not your total compensation package. Okay, so now that we know what wages means in the eyes of the law, let's see how that plugs into one of the code's most critical jobs: making sure there's a basic standard of living through a minimum wage. Now, this is a total game changer. The code introduces something called a national floor wage. The best way to think about it is as a mandatory baseline for the whole country. No state government is allowed to set its own minimum wage any lower than this national floor. It creates this fundamental safety net that stretches across India. At its very heart, the law has this one simple, incredibly powerful rule. Once a minimum wage is set, an employer just can't pay you less than that, period. It's that basic protection in action. And it's not just about the amount. The code also carries forward a really vital principle from the older laws: a complete ban on gender discrimination. If you're doing the same work or even similar work, your gender legally cannot be a factor in what you get paid. Okay, so we know what wages are, and we know there's a minimum. But what about the nitty-gritty? The practical stuff. Like, when do you actually get your salary? And how much can an employer legally take out of it? The code is super clear on this. It sets hard deadlines for payment. For instance, if you're a daily wage earner, you have to be paid at the end of your shift. No waiting. And for most of us who are monthly employees, your salary has to be in your account before the 7th day of the next month. And the how is spelled out too. I mean, sure, payment can still technically be made in cash or by check, but the law officially recognizes what's most common today: direct electronic transfers right into your bank account. Now for a question that really hits home for everyone. We all see those deductions on our payslips: provident fund, taxes, and so on. But are there limits, or can an employer just cut whatever they want? The answer is a very clear yes, there are limits. When it comes to deductions, there's one magic number you really need to remember, and that number is 50%. This is such a critical protection for employees. An employer cannot deduct more than half of your total wages in any single pay period. This cap is there to prevent a situation where things like salary advances or fines could completely wipe out your paycheck, making sure you always take home a good chunk of what you've earned. Let's switch gears and talk about something a little more exciting: the annual bonus. For a lot of people, this is a key part of their income, and yep, the code has very clear rules for this too. So first up, who even gets a bonus? Well, the eligibility rule is pretty straightforward. To qualify for the annual statutory bonus, you just have to have worked for your employer for at least 30 days in that accounting year. So how much are we talking about? The law basically sets both a floor and a ceiling. The absolute minimum bonus is 8.33% of your wages or 100 rupees, whichever amount is higher. And on the flip side, the maximum statutory bonus is capped at 20% of your wages. But, and this is a big one, can you lose your bonus? Yes, absolutely. The code is crystal clear that if an employee is dismissed for some really serious misconduct, we're talking about things like fraud, violence at work, theft, or a conviction for sexual harassment, they lose their right to that year's bonus. So after looking at wages, minimums, deductions, and bonuses, let's just take a final step back and ask the big question. Why is having this one single code so significant? You know, this quote right from the beginning of the Act really says it all. Its whole purpose is to amend and consolidate. It took that tangled web of 4 old laws and wove them into a single coherent rulebook. The goal is simple. Make it easier for employers to comply and make rights much, much clearer for millions of employees. And that really brings us to our final thought. The Code on Wages has definitely streamlined the whole legal framework. One set of rules is way better than 4. But the ultimate question is still out there. Will this simplification on paper actually translate into better enforcement and truly fair wages for every single worker on the ground? Well, that's something only time will tell.